Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Garden of Grace devotion. My name is Pastor Katie, and I'm one of the pastors at Trinity Lutheran Church in Lilburn, Georgia. During the season of Lent in the Garden of Grace devotion, we are offering a series called Created for Community. It goes along with our Wednesday afternoon and evening worship series during Lent. Last week, we talked about barriers to creating community that we discovered during the pandemic. One of those was being able to physically be with each other. One of the things that we've done at Trinity related to that is creating the prayer squares that people can take with them to the hospital and different places to be reminded that God's love has no barriers. This week, I'm very excited because I have a friend of mine here with us. He is the Reverend Dr. Jacob Kynes, and he is going to talk with us today about internal barriers to community. Jacob has been a friend of mine for over 20 years. We went to undergraduate together. We went to seminary together. One day we were both in the carpool line at Trinity Preschool, and I noticed the back of his car and I said, "No way." And it was him. We were in community together again, and here we are today as pastors in two different churches, joining together in community once again to talk about internal barriers to creating community. So, Jacob, I will invite you to talk about the church you're serving, and after you're done with your information, then I will read the passage from John.
All right. Well, first of all, it's extraordinary to be certainly with you, Katie, and it's a privilege and an honor to be a part of this series that I think, of course, is timely as it always is. And as I often think of God, God is the God of eternity and the God of the eternal present. And so, but particularly given the circumstances we're facing as a nation, as a global community, this is perhaps never more timely than it is right now. So I'm grateful to be a part of it. And just a couple of words to tell all of you who know Katie that I am as aware as you are that she is someone who exudes grace and embodies grace, and that it was grace that was afforded me the opportunity to meet her, and she's been so instructive in my life, transformative, such a support, and I can't say enough about how much I'm deeply grateful to God for that divinely appointed relationship. I'm in Washington, North Carolina, and I came from Atlanta. I was born in Atlanta, grew up in Atlanta, grew up outside of Atlanta, and then, of course, ran into Katie again in a suburb of Atlanta. And is that Lilburn? Are you in Lilburn? Yep. Okay. So, and lived in Lilburn for 3 years. But we moved to Washington, North Carolina. It's a small community. It's a wonderful community. It's on an estuary, fairly close to the Atlantic Ocean, about 35 miles in terms of water, the water routes to the Atlantic Ocean. It's a community that has a rich history. They often refer to it as the original Washington, and it has a number of extraordinary people and opportunities for community. This particular church that I'm a part of, it's First Christian Church. It's Disciples of Christ. And I'm very fortunate that it's a welcoming community, and by welcome, there are no limitations to what that means. When we say welcome, we really do mean that all are welcome, and welcome doesn't merely mean come do things the way we do them. We try to anticipate ways that we can be hospitable, and how we can, if necessary, alter some of the things that we can do to be more inviting and welcoming, so that when people arrive in this community, they'll see and feel something that is familiar with them, so that they really do feel at home. And so I'm grateful to be a part of this community.
Very good. We actually haven't talked about this, but Trinity has a very similar philosophy and heart for being a welcoming congregation. I'll have to remember, I'll send you our welcome statement sometime.
Great.
So the passage that Jacob brought to us today, as we begin to think about these things, is from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 to 12. Reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of mankind, of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light. He came only to witness to the light. The true light that gives life to everyone was coming into the world. And though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. This is the word of our Lord. Thanks be to God. So we came up with a few questions that we're gonna talk about together. And the first question that I had for Jacob related to internal barriers to community is what particular barriers have you faced, Jacob, as you have looked at building community with others? What internal barriers have you become aware of?
I think the primary internal barrier is not a thorough enough appreciation of grace, the reality of grace. And I'm careful to say the reality of grace because grace is a reality. And so there are circumstances around us, and those circumstances exist, but our circumstances can more or less approximate a true reality. And I believe that love, properly understood, is the ultimate reality. And so anytime there's an internal barrier between us and another person, could be a community of a loved one, it can be the community of our family, it can be the community of our neighborhood, our community of faith, our city, nation, and world. There is a situation, there are circumstances, if there are any barriers that do not fully reflect that reality of grace and love. And so the internal barrier is to develop a greater appreciation and to more closely approximate for ourselves to become a presence of grace. And so that was the reason in part that I selected this passage. Just even those words that sometimes we can read over pretty quickly and having a profound appreciation of a theological statement, if we'll meditate on it for a little while, even that meditation can be transformative in itself. And so we saw in verse 12, to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become children of God. So when we think about Jesus's name, we mean that we believe in his name more than a superstitious confession of a name that then somehow magically transports us from one place of being to another. The name literally means God saves, which is an action initiative that God is taking. And that's the first place to begin when we understand grace. It is God who is taking the initiative. As we understand that grace begins with God and not ourselves, then we begin to have the power. The word power simply means the ability to achieve a purpose. Apart from God, we do not have that ability, but we're not apart from God. God has taken that initiative. And once we recognize that, now we have the ability to actually become the children of God we were created to be. And so this theme, created for community, we were created for community. We were created for relationship. And so we begin to recognize that one of the great initiatives that now we're called to take that is often inspired, literally inspired, God-breathed, is a desire for community. We actually have a God-given desire to be in community with God and one another. So a better recognition of the importance of grace, that all begins and ends with grace. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that Word is always a word of grace, absolute, unconditional love. And so I often say that when we come to appreciate what the reality of grace, we recognize there's nothing we can do to earn more of God's love. God only loves in one way, and that's completely, entirely, infinitely. And so that being the case, we can never do anything to lose God's love. And I know that comes to some people, they think, well, then there's no deterrent for certain kinds of behavior. But what I've come to see is that once we understand and as we grow in an experiential knowledge of the grace of God, we begin to love God, not because we're afraid of the alternative. That's not even love. We begin to love God because we cannot help ourselves to respond to that kind of love. And so, again, one of the barriers I see is people have not received, to say to all who received that grace, that initiative of divine grace, they become the children of God. And as we become children of God, we begin to love as God loves. We begin to see people for who they truly are, despite any presentation they are giving to us, despite whatever they're reflecting in the moment. And so I often say this: our true nature is that we are children of God. All of us have a human condition, but the human nature is that we are children of God. So we talk, well, that's just human nature. Well, just human nature, there's no just to it. We're children of God. That's who we are. Our condition is often contrary to our nature. And so one of the ways of overcoming these barriers is over time cultivating and growing in our ability to align our condition with our nature. And as we do, we're aware of how difficult that is. And so it prevents us from being too harsh on other people in our judgment and perceptions, because we know our condition and how difficult it is to transcend. How can we be so judgmental of another person whose condition in this moment may be in that particular area out of alignment with their true nature? And the greatest service we can do anyone is try to reflect that grace of God, because that's what woos people toward transformation, that invitation to grace and love. And so again, I think it's one of the barriers to strengthening community is a misunderstanding of grace. Another barrier for us, and I'll try to be brief with this because this is something I give a lot of thought to, is the lack of appreciation for just how limited our view is. And so in different religious traditions, I know there are different emphases on various sources that inform our faith. So if we're going to cultivate our faith, where do we even look? Let's say we were a beginner, we were converted, had a conversion experience, and we recognize the way of Jesus as the way, the teachings of Jesus as the teachings that are the teachings that we want to follow. Let's say we walk into a bookstore, or one of those big box bookstores for the first time, and we land in the Christianity section. Where do we even begin? Let's say we even land in the Bible section. Where would we even begin? I mean, these different translations, these different study Bibles, these different publishers, where do we even begin? And so it's important for us to think about what sources inform our faith. Historically, and there are some religious traditions that emphasize some sources more than others. Some will say the Bible, of course, is a source, and people will say our tradition, our denominational tradition, that's a source. Some will often say our reason, of course, is the source, and this is we're going to borrow from our United Methodist brothers and sisters and say also experience is another source. What I've come to observe is that our experience, it does not determine, but it's difficult to overstate the degree to which it influences how we read Scripture, how we interpret our tradition, and even how we think. We become conditioned, if we're not careful over time, through our limited experience, to view the world, including the world of the Bible, the world of history, and the world of different ways of thinking through our very limited experience. So I would add a fifth to those four. And that would be community, and intentional community with people whose experiences are not like ours. When is the last time, for whether it's Christian or with another person of another faith or a person with no faith, what is that person's experience? What is their experience with Christianity? What is their experience with God? What is their viewpoint based on their unique perspective and their unique history? And so I think it's important to intentionally engage with people whose positions are not like our own. I just read very quickly, I think it's worth noting, I was looking at how and why people have a difficulty in thinking about opinions and convictions beyond their own. And part of the reason I actually came across this in one of Richard Rohr's devotions, I believe it was yesterday, but it was talking about it's the convenience of identifying with opinions and convictions that are agreeable to us that we already share because we like to think in efficient ways. We begin to consider other people's views. It requires us to have to stop for a while. It requires mental labor and energy to consider the thoughts of another. And then also when there are people who are sharing a perspective that we agree with, there's actually a visceral response that's pleasant. We enjoy hearing people share a perspective that is like our own. And so we have to, that's the reason I use the word intentional. We have to intentionally engage in community, and I would say charitably, to go back to grace, to take the initiative to charitably, and I don't mean in a condescending kind of charity, I mean in love properly understood. We're intentionally listening to other people with a desire to truly understand where they're coming from and to better understand their experience. And in so doing, that is an extraordinary first step in strengthening community and overcoming that barrier. And so those are the two that I see, that people isolate themselves and surround themselves with people who think just like themselves, more or less. And there's not a robust enough understanding of grace, the absolute unconditional love of God.
I'm hearing you say that we are all children of God.
That's right.
All in different levels of transformation, or different spaces, not levels even, because that there's a delineation there, but in different areas of transformation in our lives as truly trying to understand and receive and live out of this abundant grace that God gives us. And in our different ways of being transformed as children of God into this incredible grace, it can be far easier for us to talk to and learn from and exchange ideas with someone who is like us. There's a visceral response that is pleasant, and so it reinforces that pleasant experience of talking to people that are similar and have similar ideas. But the challenge that I'm hearing you offer is, when is the last time that I sat down with someone who was very different from myself, theologically, in settings in life, in all kinds of, in any way? When is the last time that I sat down with somebody who was entirely different from me on a subject, and I understood them as also a child of God, and I had a deep desire to learn about who they are as a reflection of God, as God's child? That's the challenging that I'm hearing you offer.